Amy sat in her dimly lit room, the television casting pale blue light across her face as a news anchor described the latest tragedy. Another young woman found lifeless under mysterious circumstances, her story reduced to a 2-minute segment between commercials. Amy hugged her knees tighter. It seemed like every other week there was a new headline, a new family torn apart, a new girl who had simply been trying to live her life. She muted the television and stared at the ceiling. She was not naive about the world's dangers, but she refused to let fear swallow her. She still believed in something gentle, something real. Somewhere out there was a man worth waiting for, responsible, respectful, and tender enough to build a life with. Not a perfect man in the fairy tale sense, but a genuinely good one. That was all she had ever asked for. Not wealth, not status, just love, honest and steady as rainfall. She had carried that belief through every year of high school while her friends cycled through heartbreaks and situationships. They called her old-fashioned. She called it standards. And so she remained single, patient, and quietly hopeful. The evening of the college get-together arrived wrapped in golden light, and the sound of jazz drifting through the lobby of the Grand Meridian Hotel. The building was the kind of place that made ordinary people feel temporarily extraordinary. Marble floors, chandeliers dripping crystal, staff who smiled like they meant it. Amy called her best friend, Hazel, the night before. "I'm not walking in there alone," Amy said. "You're never alone when I'm breathing," Hazel laughed. "Come stay over. We'll go together." They arrived arm in arm, a picture of easy friendship. The lobby buzzed with former classmates air-kissing and trading life updates. But before they could take the elevator to the main hall, Hazel tugged Amy's sleeve. "Hold on. Let me use the restroom downstairs. Come with me. I hate hotel toilets alone." Amy followed, and in the mirror above the sinks, she touched up the edges of her lipstick, while Hazel washed her hands and studied her with that particular look, the one that preceded unwanted wisdom. "Still searching?" Hazel asked without preamble. "Still searching," Amy confirmed. "For this imaginary, responsible, respectful, gentle man who will love you dearly." Hazel dried her hands slowly. "You do realize you're describing a unicorn." "I'm describing basic decency. You don't even care if he's broke?" Hazel shook her head. "You're a different species, Amy." Then her voice shifted. "What about David?" Amy capped her lipstick. "What about David?" "Don't pretend. David has loved you since Form 3. He has every quality on your little list. He's kind. He's grounded. He's never once disrespected you." "David is like a brother to me," Amy said firmly. "We literally grew up on the same street." "Hazel, I cannot date someone I used to argue with over cartoon reruns." Hazel opened her mouth, closed it, and simply said, "Weird girl." What neither of them noticed, as they pushed open the restroom door and stepped back into the lobby, was the man who had been seated just around the corner, close enough to hear every word. Jose folded his phone into his pocket, adjusted the collar of his jacket, and smiled to himself. Then he walked back to his seat and waited. Upstairs, the reunion unfolded in warm laughter and disbelief at how much everyone had changed. Name tags were pointless. Half the room had reinvented themselves entirely. When introductions circled the room, David stood up and said simply, "David Mensa. I work in information technology." He did not elaborate on the firm, the contracts, the government consultancies, or the fact that 3 different agencies had quietly approached him in the last year. He just smiled and sat down, the same unhurried calm he had always carried. He tried, through the evening, to be near Amy. He brought her a drink she hadn't asked for. He laughed at the right moments near her. But Amy's attention had already been rerouted. Jose had made his approach with the elegance of someone who had practiced it into instinct. He arrived at her table not with a line, but with a question, something about whether the music reminded her of anything, a genuinely curious look on his face that made Amy feel immediately seen. He was handsome in a precise, almost architectural way. He listened when she talked. He laughed without performing it. By the end of the evening, he had her number, and she had the sensation of someone who had perhaps, finally, found what she was looking for. David watched from across the room and said nothing. Their first date was at a rooftop restaurant downtown. The city spread below them like scattered jewelry. Amy wore the green dress Hazel had once told her was her best color. Jose arrived exactly on time. She was 3 courses in and half convinced she was falling in love when she heard her name. Amy. She turned. David stood at a table 2 rows away, clearly as surprised as she was, his dinner companion mid-sentence. He recovered quickly, nodded politely, and that was all. But his eyes lingered on Jose for a half-second longer than was casual. On the drive home, something nagged at David. He had heard the name Jose once before, or something close to it, in a context he could not immediately place. A briefing, perhaps. A name in the margins of a document. He was not sure enough to speak. So instead he went home, opened his laptop, and started looking. What he found over the next 72 hours did not arrive all at once. It came in fragments, a flagged alias, a shell company registered across 2 borders, associations with a distribution network that law enforcement had been quietly mapping for years. And then, attached to that network like a shadow, a name that made his stomach drop. Tiana. David drove to Amy's apartment on a Sunday afternoon, rehearsing every version of the conversation and knowing none of them would land well. "I need to show you something," he said when she opened the door. Amy folded her arms. "David, please, 5 minutes." She let him in, but she did not sit down. He laid his laptop on the coffee table and began walking her through it. The connections, the timeline, the pattern that emerged when you looked at it long enough. Amy stared at the screen. Her face was still. He could not tell what she was thinking. And then she looked up and he could tell exactly what she was thinking, and it was worse than he feared. "You're doing this because you're in love with me," she said. "Amy, I know, David. I've always known. And I'm telling you directly because I respect you too much to pretend I don't. I am not going to be with you. Not because there's anything wrong with you, but because I don't feel that way, and you digging up nonsense about a man I'm happy with does not change that. It makes it worse." David closed the laptop slowly. "You need to stay out of my relationship," she said. It was not cruel. It was worse than cruel. It was final. He picked up his things and left. And standing in the corridor outside her door, he made a decision that cost him more than he ever admitted to anyone. He decided he was done. She had made her choice. He would not chase a woman who had explicitly asked him not to. He went home. He closed the files. He tried to sleep. He managed his resolve for 11 days. Then his assistant Gabby, young and breathless and constitutionally incapable of lowering his voice, burst into his office one morning with an update. "Boss, Tiana's flight has been rebooked. She's coming back within the month." David stopped typing, because here was what the data showed, laid out so plainly it was almost elegant in its brutality. Every time Tiana returned to the country, women died. Not randomly. Women connected to Jose. Women who had perhaps seen something, suspected something, or simply existed too close to a secret that needed keeping. It was a pattern so consistent it had the rhythm of a ritual. And Amy had been with Jose for 4 months now. David reopened the files. Amy was not entirely blind. She simply had not wanted to see. The first fracture came during a dinner at Jose's apartment when Fred arrived unannounced, face tight with something urgent. Before he could speak more than 3 words, Jose rose from the table, crossed the room in 4 steps, and slapped him across the face. The wine glass followed, red blooming across Fred's white shirt like something from a nightmare. The room went silent. Jose turned back to Amy, and the transformation was immediate, seamless, almost frightening in its speed. He was soft again. He was sorry. He held her face in his hands and explained that he was simply under enormous pressure, that it would never happen again, that Fred had overstepped in ways she could not understand. He tickled her until she laughed. She hated herself for laughing. The second fracture came 3 weeks later. She was exploring his apartment, idly, the way you do in a space you started to feel comfortable in, when her hand landed on the handle of a door she had never seen opened. She turned it. Jose's hand closed around her chin before the latch clicked. Not violent, not yet, but precise and cold, and entirely unlike anything he had ever done before. Not that room, he said softly. She looked into his eyes and found something in them she did not have a word for. She stepped back. He released her. He smiled. That night, alone in her own apartment, Amy sat on the edge of her bed and tried to locate the feeling she kept pushing down. She could not name it yet, but it was there. What Amy did not know was that Jose had been making arrangements. Tiana was possessive in the way that certain people are possessive, not from love, but from ownership. She did not tolerate women in Jose's orbit, and Jose, who feared almost nothing else on earth, feared Tiana's return. And so, in the weeks before her flight landed, he had made certain calls. Certain problems had been quietly resolved. A woman who had once spent 3 evenings with him at a conference had recently stopped answering her phone. Another had relocated abruptly, or so the story went. Amy was on a list she did not know existed. But Jose, despite everything, had not yet made that call. Whether it was sentiment or strategy, he had not decided. He was a man who operated on patience and calculation, and Amy had become a complication he had not fully resolved. He was running out of time. The deeper David went, the colder he became. Not emotionally cold, rather the focused, near hypothermic clarity of someone who has stripped away everything except the problem. He worked with a contact at the organized crime unit, a detective named Reyes who had been building a case against Jose's network for 2 years. David brought him 3 months of digital forensics in a single encrypted folder. Reyes looked at it for 40 minutes and then looked at David. How did you get this? Does it matter? It will in court. Then let's make sure it doesn't need to go to court the long way. They built the case in parallel, official channels running visible and slow, David's contributions threading through it quietly. It was careful, painstaking work. David barely slept. He ate at his desk. Gabby, still bearing the faint memory of a bruised cheek, became his most loyal ally, feeding what little he knew from the inside of Jose's circle. Through it all, David did not contact Amy. She had asked him not to. He would honor that even now. He would try to save her life without her permission. Tiana arrived on a Thursday. She was not what anyone expected of someone so dangerous. She was refined, composed, and moved through the world like someone who had never been told no and therefore never developed a reflex to accommodate it. She considered Jose's women the way a collector considers forgeries. Offensive not because they existed, but because they implied she could be replaced. She made one call to Jose the evening she landed. Jose sat with his phone pressed to his ear for a long time after she hung up. Then he called a number he kept in a separate device. The first attempt was made to look like misfortune, a car that should not have pulled out when it did, on a road Amy walked every Tuesday evening. She stepped into a shop window 30 seconds before it happened, distracted by a display. The car clipped a bollard instead. The second was more deliberate. Something added to a drink at a gathering she attended without Jose. She felt wrong within an hour, called a friend, and was driven home. She attributed it to something she had eaten. She did not connect it to anything. The third brought David to his knees. He received a notification at 2 a.m. from a secondary device he had set up to monitor certain movement patterns. He was dressed and in his car before he was fully awake, phoning Reyes with one hand while navigating with the other. He arrived at Amy Street to find a man at her building entrance who disappeared into a side road the moment headlights appeared. David sat outside her building until sunrise. He did not go in. He did not call her. But after that night, he stopped honoring her request for distance because some things are more important than being respected. He came to her door at 9 a.m. with printed documents, photographs, and 3 years of patience dissolved into urgency. Amy opened the door and the first thing she did was sigh. David, someone tried to get into your building last night. She paused. I was there. I watched him leave. He held out the documents. Amy, I need you to look at this. Not as someone who loves you, just as a person. Look at it and tell me I'm wrong. She almost closed the door. Something stopped her, perhaps the way he looked, which was not jealous or hopeful, but simply exhausted. The way people look when they have been carrying something heavy for too long. She stepped back and let him in. She read for a long time. The silence was different this time. The room, she said quietly, almost to herself. The room he wouldn't let me open. David said nothing. Gabby. She looked up. He knew what Gabby was about to say that night. Yes. She set the papers down with the careful deliberateness of someone making sure their hands do not shake. What do we do? She asked. And just like that, we became possible between them again. The operation took 11 days to fully execute. Detective Reyes moved on Jose's network from 3 directions simultaneously. Financial irregularities gave them the first warrant. David's forensic trail gave them the evidence to hold it together in front of a judge. Gabby, granted protection, agreed to testify. Jose was arrested on a Wednesday morning outside a restaurant. He was composed until the cuffs were on, and then something in his face gave way, not into fear, but into a kind of exhausted relief that Amy, watching the news footage later that evening, found unexpectedly human and deeply sad. Tiana was picked up at the airport 24 hours later, boarding pass in hand. The locked room, when investigators finally opened it, contained exactly what David had suspected. Documentation of transactions, communications, and records that dismantled the facade entirely. The network was larger than Reyes had estimated. The prosecutions that followed stretched across 18 months. 3 families received phone calls that brought them answers they had been waiting years for. The girls from the headlines. The girls from Amy's television screen. Amy did not rush toward David. She was not the kind of woman to ricochet from one man's arms into another's, and David was not the kind of man to catch her on the rebound, even if she had tried. They spent time instead in the ordinary way, talking the way they always had, with the ease of people whose history is long enough to hold silence comfortably. She apologized once, plainly and without excessive ceremony, and he accepted it the same way. You were protecting yourself, he said. The way you read it, a man in love interfering in your relationship, that was a reasonable interpretation. It was a convenient one, she corrected. He smiled. It was Hazel who said what everyone else was thinking at a dinner 6 months later, when Amy and David sat across from each other, and the air between them had that particular quality that air acquires when two people have made a quiet decision they haven't fully announced yet. I said it in the hotel bathroom, Hazel said, setting down her fork. 3 years ago, I said David has every quality on your list. Nobody ever listens to me. Amy laughed. It was the laugh David had been protecting across forensic files and sleepless nights, and a door he had sat outside until sunrise, full and unguarded and entirely worth it. They married on a Saturday in October, in a ceremony small enough to feel real. David had long since stopped needing to prove himself. He simply was what he had always been, steady, decent, and embarrassingly in love with his wife, which Amy found she did not mind at all. She had wanted a gentle man. She had wanted responsibility and respect, and a love that did not perform itself. She had, it turned out, wanted David. She just needed the long way round to find out. Somewhere in the city, a news anchor was leading with another headline. Amy reached across the sofa and turned the television off. David looked up from his laptop. "Everything okay?" "Everything's fine," she said, and settled into the warmth beside him. And for the first time in a long time, that was exactly true.